Good morning. I'm reading the book Freedom Crossing with permission from Scholastic, and I'll be reading Chapter 2, Dangerous Business. Complete silence followed Laura's outburst. For a moment, she enjoyed the look of gaping surprise on the three faces that were turned toward her. She saw Bert's shock change into anger, while Martin's eyes, white in the dark face, rolled toward the back door as if searching for an escape. How small he was, thought Laura. Much smaller than Bert, though he was only a year younger. Joel Todd came toward her, and Laura was amazed at his height and the breadth of his shoulders. He was a man for sure. Searching for his face for traces of her playmate, she noted that his thick brown hair still lopped onto his forehead, but his lean cheeks and jaw were completely unfamiliar. His eyes held no hint of the friendly warmth she remembered. They regarded her coolly as he made a mock bow. "I see we have an eavesdropper in our midst," he said. Laura drew in a quick breath and lifted her head defiantly. "All right, I was listening, and I didn't like what I heard. Eavesdroppers seldom hear good of themselves." "I'm not talking about myself," said Laura sharply. "I mean, I'm sorry to find out you and Pa and Bert are breaking the law." Joel's eyes narrowed. "It's a law that ought to be broken. Do you think you know more about what's right than the Congress of the United States?" "Well, not ordinarily, but in this case I do. It's a cruel law that says we have to send fugitive slaves back to their masters." Joel pushed a chair toward her. "Here, sit down, so Martin can get off his feet." Laura considered defying him. He cared more for that runaway's comfort than hers. She glanced at Martin. He was tired. The way his knees were sagging, he'd been on the floor in another minute. She dropped onto the chair. "Please sit down, Martin," she said politely. She kept her eyes on him, trying to ignore Joel's critical gaze. "Martin, when was the last time you ate?" He cocked his head as if searching his memory. I had supper night before last, and I did find some chestnuts in the woods today." "Just as I thought." Laura looked indignantly at her brother. "He's hungry, and you haven't offered him a thing to eat." For the first time since she had come into the kitchen, Joel looked at Laura with approval. "Well, good for you," he said. Laura, doggedly honest, replied, "I don't think Martin should be here, but since he is, he should be fed." Bert seized the poker and lifted one of the two lids off the top of the little cook stove. Joel said quickly, "Don't stir up the fire. The sparks and smoke might draw notice to the house." Bert put aside the poker. "Oh, I didn't think. I'll see what I can find ready to eat." He crossed to the cellar door behind the stove and disappeared down the stairs. Shortly he returned with a half-baked ham, butter, and a jug of milk. As he set them on the table, he remarked proudly, "It's a wonder that way my stepmother keeps the larder full. Pa and I never ate half so well when we were batching it up." Laura set out plates and mugs. "Where do you keep the bread?" she asked her brother. Bert produced a loaf of homemade bread from a cupboard beside the sink. Joel said in obvious surprise, "You've been home 2 weeks, Laura, and you didn't know where the bread was?" Without answering him, Laura began to slice the bread. It was no use explaining, she thought. He'd never understand how it had been in Virginia, where Sukey and Della did all the kitchen work, and Aunt Ruth merely planned the meals. Laura had been able to cook as well as any woman when she first went south, but she had rarely helped with the meals during the past 4 years. Aunt Ruth thought it was more important and fitting for her to learn to sew a fine seam and practice her music lessons, for if she stayed in Virginia, she would marry the son of a wealthy planter and would always have slaves to do the work of the house. When the food was ready, Bert said, Time to eat, Martin. You too, Joel. Martin said politely, "You're very kind, sir." Laura was puzzled by the way he talked. He didn't sound like the slaves she had known, but almost as if he had been to school. When they were seated around the table, she couldn't help noticing that, hungry as Martin must be, he didn't bolt his food. He must have had a good master who had taught him well. "Martin's expected in Canada," remarked Joel, spreading butter on a piece of bread. "Tomorrow, from midnight until 2 o'clock in the morning, his father will wait for him on the Canadian shore, north of Queenston. Mr. Page is already settled in Niagara, on Lake Ontario, with his wife and I believe 2 other children." Martin spoke up. "That's right, Master Todd. I've got a brother, 9 years old, and a baby sister." Joel said, "All we have to do is get Martin across the Niagara River tomorrow night." "How are we going to do that?" asked Bert. "Pa never let me go with him." He sounded resentful. "I should have gone, and then I'd know what to do now." "Don't worry about it," Joel answered. "It's all arranged. A fisherman will let his boat drift downstream tomorrow night, just before midnight. I suppose I should say tonight, since it is past midnight now, but you know what I mean. At any rate, the fisherman will pull ashore at a certain spot to untangle his lines." "Where?" asked Bert. For a long moment, Joel's level gray eyes met Bert's. Then he shook his head. "You don't need to know. My father and I will come back here after the moon sets tomorrow night and take Martin there." Bert pulled back as if he had been slapped. "I wouldn't tell," he muttered. Joel raised his hand for silence. "Listen." He quietly pushed back his chair and went to the door, where he held his ear close to the crack. Then he moved to the window to tuck the thick homespun curtain more securely against the frame. In the stillness, Laura heard the same howling she had noticed before. Now it came from the south, but was closer than ever. Probably those were the dogs that were searching for Martin. However, Joel didn't seem concerned about the dogs. "I thought I heard someone outside the door," he said as he returned to the table. "I've never seen such a crowd after one fugitive." He smiled at Martin. "You must be valuable." Martin answered soberly, "My master likes to catch any runaway slave, so he can take him back and show the other slaves it doesn't pay to escape from him." Laura felt a cold shudder run up her back. She had heard that runaways were sometimes beaten. Martin was so thin he didn't look able to take such a punishment, but tales of masters who beat slaves were rarely true, she reminded herself. Uncle Jim said those tales were made up to get sympathy. Bert asked, "Are there slave catchers all around Lewiston?" Laura knew he was still trying to decide whether or not to keep Martin. Joel answered with a brief yes. Bert looked at Laura and then away. "I wish Pa were home." Joel frowned and stood up. He paced impatiently the length of the kitchen and back. "Bert, make up your own mind. I tell you, I don't know another place I'd dare take Martin tonight. I doubt if it would even be safe to take him out that door. We may have been followed here." He pushed back his forelock. "We've had a fugitive at our house for 2 days, and we've been watching so close we haven't been able to send him across the river." Martin looked up with interest. "What's his name?" "George. That's the only name he'll tell us. He said he was given his master's last name, and he wants to forget that. When he's a free man, he'll take a new name of his own choosing." "Maybe some of the slave catchers are looking for George," suggested Bert. Joel shook his head. "I don't think they know anything about him. They all ask about a boy named Martin Page, and they have his description. Of course, they'll pick up any black person they see, but right now it's Martin they're hunting." Bert came to a decision. "We'll keep him. I'm sure that's what Pa would do. I don't know where we'll hide him, though." Joel looked surprised. "Hide him in the usual place, of course." Laura has the room where the trap door is, Bert explained. He kept his eyes away from his sister. Oh? Joel shrugged. Let her sleep someplace else tonight. Laura seethed with anger. They acted as if she weren't in the room. I don't know anything about a trap door in my room. You must have put it in there while I was in Virginia. But do either of you realize what would happen to Pa if you get caught hiding Martin? She demanded. We know the law, said Joel. The fine for helping a runaway is $1,000, plus maybe another $1,000 to pay the cost of the slave if he escapes. That's $2,000, Laura gasped. We might lose our farm. But your pa isn't involved this time, Joel protested. It's all my doing. If Martin is found in our house, Pa will get the blame, declared Laura. I'll say leaving Martin here was my own idea, Joel assured her. Bert's only 13, so I figure the law won't hold him accountable. Laura scoffed. And suppose you take the blame, where will you get the $2,000? Joel grinned. You're right. No one could get that much money from me. Guess I'll have to cool my heels in jail for about 6 months. But then his smile disappeared. No one's going to know Martin's here. That is, unless you tell them. Laura tried to match the coolness of his eyes and failed. I'm no tattletale, she said angrily. Good. Then go up and get the things you want out of your room before we bring Martin up. Laura stared at Joel in disbelief. Was it possible he was ordering her out of her own room? Again, the feeling of homesickness and aloneness swept over her. She thought of her clothes spread over a chair, her bed with the covers tossed back, the bookshelf over her desk. This runaway slave had no right to her room. She faced Joel rebelliously. You'll have to find another place to hide Martin. I'm not giving up my room.